certainly at the beginning of our practice, and stays with us for some, go into the Zendo, and there's this sense of just kind of feeling out everybody else sat on the cushion. And this sense of, well, how come they're all so good? How come they all clearly get it? Why am I the only one that really doesn't understand this? I mean, I can feel it. They're just sat there, so cool, like mountains. And there's me, kind of feeling fidgety. And then maybe we've had a couple of cool experiences. Maybe we just really get used to it and we feel, hey, I mean, look at that guy over there, fidgeting, crazy, can't keep still. What about them? The posture. Look at them, really, they're just trying too hard. And obviously, we're judging. And then maybe in either case, we remember Barry's little saying. Basic meditation instruction, basic Zazen instruction. You can't do it wrong. And then maybe we judge ourselves for not getting it that there's nothing to get, not getting it that we think other people are doing it right, not getting it that we think other people are doing wrong and we shouldn't because there's nothing to get. So we're judging ourselves about that. And obviously we can just play that game forever, but why? And it's tempting to fall back on the idea of, this is just my ego, it's misbehaving, it's my inner selfishness. And, well, I suppose what I want to suggest is it's much, much, much more interesting than that. Judgment, this kind of juridical mindset. Am I clean or am I dirty? Am I innocent or am I guilty? Am I a winner or a loser? And that's really, we can begin to think about how the whole of our social world, our social system is predicated on the idea of winners and losers. And winners deserve to win and losers, they deserve to lose. It's the basic idea of, what in highfalutin terms we can call the liberal subject, or what economists talk about as Homo economicus, economic man. And what in Buddhism we talk about as this fantasy of the isolated, separate self. Now, it's easy to say that when we're doing this kind of judging, either of ourselves or others, we're trying to keep ourselves at the centre of things, make the story all about us. And in one sense, that's absolutely true. Can't really argue. In another sense, it's missing, exactly half the point. Because in order to judge me against you, you against me, him against her, whatever, I separate myself from myself. Look, obviously, if I'm judging you for a quality you have or a quality you lack. But then if I'm judging myself, I'm doing exactly the same thing. One part of me, part's not really maybe a very good metaphor, aspect, one mode of me, is judging the presence or absence of a particular quality. I'm actually separating out from myself. Looking at me over there. Am I a winner? Am I a loser? What am I losing when I'm doing that? Well, what I'm losing is my reality, my experience, my awareness, my bodily sensation, my emotion, my actually all that I am. Saying I'm judging equality, very often what we're doing in this kind of thing is labelling, coding, constructing identities. And again, this is something kind of emerges out the way that we use language, conceive of language, maybe especially here in the West, but it's not just a Western problem. If I try and say who I am, or ask you, who are you? Beyond giving me your name and date of birth, to say anything actually about you, you're saying what you are. And to say what you are, implicitly, what absolutely requires to say what you're not. I'm a man. I am not a woman. I am white. I am not a person of colour. And so on, and so on, and so on. Am I educated? Am I smart? Am I so many different things? And we don't tend to realise this because very often the not is invisible. So when I talk about mankind, it's perfectly obvious that all normal people have penises. Men. Obvious. Goes without saying. And then we have to put in another marker to mention the ones who don't, who aren't, who are women. And so on. We assume it's normal to have light skin. If I have darker skin, well, that's worthy of remark, isn't it? So many ways in which we have the kind of white, male, educated as the norm, as having, being, and define everything else as lacking. We can do this in terms of class, we can do this in terms of ethnic background, we can do this in terms of wealth, we can do this in infinite numbers of ways. And we display this through accent, through manners, bodily posture, so many different kinds of coding. We might simply say, oh, yeah, but surely that's not essential. We're trying to get beyond. But how do we do that? Because I'm caught in this kind of web of this, not that. And what is actually just one giant competitive ranking system. Does it matter? Honestly, I think we have to say it does. A couple of really interesting social scientists, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. This is their second book, The Inner Level. Their first book, The Spirit Level, trying to remember the actual subtitle, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better, in just about everything. Explored exactly that, the effect of inequality on society as a whole. Not just poor people get a bum deal, we know that. People of colour get a bum deal, we know that. But just how it actually works. And the fact that greater inequality leads to all kinds of problems. Fair enough, we'll deal with that actually at some length another time. The interesting thing about this second book, The Inner Level, is the way it points to how that shows up as judging. So, in less equal societies, children get bullied more at school. And you can take that through across nation after nation after nation. Pretty consistent fact. You can say, oh, it's just different traditions, different cultures. Well, no, because over time, obviously, you can see these nations getting more unequal or less unequal. And guess what? The rates of bullying go up or down accordingly. Judgment begets inequality. Inequality begets judgment. We become different kinds of people according to how we have this basic relationship with ourselves of the degree of separation, which shows up as the degree of inequality in our society. So actually, when I'm sat there in the Zendo going, or in awe or contempt, all I'm doing is actually just expressing how my society expects me to respond, how my society expects me to function, the values my society expects me to hold. And we won't attempt to answer them now, but we could ask those questions. Who do I mean by this? Who's expecting? Why? What's the result of this? We'll begin to, touch on some of these things another time. But in the Zendo, how do we actually get over this? Well, I'd like to suggest it's actually by getting to know people, by getting to experience the people that we're sitting with as people, not as objects in competition with me for whatever, I don't know. Teacher's praise, best seat in the Zendo, whatever. But as real people, as people we can have empathy with, as people we can understand, people we know something about. Now look, in terms that I was talking about identities a moment ago, we can talk about that kind of recognition, labelling recognitions, recognition as recognitions being this, or recognition as being that, or recognition as being not that at all. And I think we can agree, and we've already been looking at it in relation to what we talk about the sixth precept, about approaching and talking about people with openness and possibility. I mean, clearly this is the opposite of that, isn't it? It's talking about people with preconceptions and definitive judgments. And there's a sense in which you can say, well, that's just shutting the box on them. We've put them in a pigeonhole and now we're shutting the box and it's got a nice label. So what we're doing when we're getting to know people, we can talk about recognition in another sense, in a second sense, a kind of fundamental recognition. It's not recognition as. It involves recognition of being the same kind of thing, of being, well, vulnerable, having intentions, having aspirations, having emotions, hoping, fearing, suffering. All of these things of being, well, another centre. Actually, you're the same kind of thing as me. This gets very interesting because we can come to understand that actually our mutuality is not just two things standing side by side. Oh yeah, there's me and there's you. And that would be to just do the same thing we were doing when we were judging, We're just comparing. Understand that the relationship of mutuality is far more essential than that. How do I really know I exist at a deep level? How do I know what it is to be this thing, this being at a deep level? Well, we can go back to our earliest days, and this is something we talked about before, and doubtless we'll talk about it again. How, as a child, do I begin to know that I am a centre? Well, is by experiencing myself in relationship to my carers. Conventionally the mother, but all those people who are essential to my care, those people who look after me, see to my needs, but not just in a passive sense. Those people who interact with me, and the key here is the inter bit of the interact. I can come to begin to see that they have intentions, they have feelings, they can be hurt, they can be angry, they can be sad. And actually observing, understanding, I can begin to see that I can be these things as well, and that actually what I want, need, demand isn't necessarily the same as what they're thinking. We're separate, and yet we are literally always in relationship. We are mutually necessary to each other. I matter because I matter to you and you matter to me. And without that mutuality, there is no mattering. What happens when this breaks down? We get a relation of dominance. And of course, all relationships are always moving in and out of dominance, because all relationships are always unequal, and there's always a certain amount of feeling out, testing, elbowing going along. Those of us who have children will know that. If we're insightful, those of us who ever were children will also recognise this, but hopefully you get the general idea. But at the grand level, at the philosophical level, it's the German 18th, 19th century philosopher Hegel who kind of nails this best with the dialectic of the master and the slave. And as I may have mentioned before, this is several thousand pages of the densest possible philosophy, and we're going to do it all in about a minute and a half maybe, so, fair dues, but we'll do what we can. The master exerts dominance over the slave, and ultimately the guarantee of that is the threat of physical violence, obviously. I can compel you, absolutely. And in the classical sense of this, the slave is there purely for the master. The slave has no will of their own. They're obliged to do literally anything the master tells them. They see to every possible need of the master. The master's only real activity, involvement in this sense, is to command and to wave the stick. And that's obviously a relationship of appalling dominance. And yet, the master is actually dependent on the slave, literally dependent. They can't or don't, or it would be beneath them or impossible for them to actually look after themselves, to actually give themselves the kind of care which they rely on the slave for. But there's something else which the master lacks, which is true recognition of an equal, of another. Obviously, the master can command the slave to recognise them. And this is worthless because the slave has no will, cannot offer this mutuality of recognition, can only ever be an object of domination. The slave can never matter. The master can torture the slave, dismiss the slave, dismember the slave. The master never matters in the slave's eyes either. It's just like being run over by a bus, blown off a cliff by a hurricane. There's no relationship here. Actual mutual recognition can only occur at moments of equality. And that can just literally be in moments. A significant eye contact, a shared joke, If we think about this, what we're looking for, what we're aspiring to with relationship, is some kind of other space in which we can meet, which is actually the equal ground which our Zen precepts talk about. How do we meet? Where do we meet? And again, going back in child development terms, things like rocking, we share a movement. Things like teaching a child nursery rhyme, we share the sound. Things like playing peepo. I'm gone, I'm here. It's a disaster. No, it's not. And so on and so on and so on. And so many of these things, weirdly, we mirror in the Zendo. We learn to sing the same thing at the same time. If we're in the physical Zendo, we learn to walk at the same time. We coordinate our movements. We build, in subtle ways, relationship. If this doesn't happen, to the degree that this doesn't happen, because there is failure of relationship, constantly, rupture, hopefully we can repair it. This is something which persists with us into adult life, obviously. We have relationship, we think it's going well, rupture, it falls apart. Can we rebuild? Have we got the shared space? The analyst Jessica Benjamin talks about this as finding thirds. Things we can agree on, a space of known enough, I suppose you could say, predictable enough, that we have enough of the shared assumptions, the same way of the world works, the same kind of view of what this is, that we can fall out, that we can find difference, but then we can re-find connection despite that. As children, the great enemy of relationship is really shame, which we've talked about at length. Because shame is the most easy, the most natural, the most easily at hand form of dominance, of violence which isn't overtly violent, but as a way of saying, you don't matter. Right now, in this context, you don't matter. But when we do have relationship, when we find relationship, it is exactly that sense of mattering to each other, that I recognise that you have wishes, desires, fears of your own that are like mine, but not mine. We're similar, but we're also different. We are mutually necessary, and we are not separate, but we are not the same. Maintaining this spatiality is difficult. If you look at the way that philosophy, 2,500 years, has struggled desperately to try and hold this understanding, and generally fails and falls right back into talking about various kinds of dominance and justifying various kinds of dominance of one over another, one group over another. It's complicated. And yet, at the heart of relationship, there is this literal and simple recognition, this delight in the other, this delight of the other delighting in you, and the delight at that delight. We can talk about this in terms of parent and child. We can talk about this in terms of relationships within the Sangha. We can talk about this in terms of relationships with our partners, all these immediate. But I think it's worth pointing to the way that this kind of thing works on 3 different modes. Obviously, there's that which we think of as the interpersonal, the intersubjective, like that. But it's also vital to recognise that this begins at the intra-subjective level, at my own complexity, my own contradictions, my own splits within myself. In actual fact, recognising this is always really going to be the basis of my ability to understand that you're like me, but not like me. And all my frantic efforts to obliterate my own difference, my own complexity, my own contradictions, and be just this one thing. Me, me, me. How can I ever recognise anybody else in existence, even if I'm just me? I'm multiple. I'm so much. Good and bad. Normal and strange. Whatever. I never just my identities. But equally, we can go the other way and talk about the extra subjective, the extra self. What happens at the societal level or the international level. Unless we can recognise the other as like, but different, we can't understand that they have needs, they suffer. My version, my account, my story about their needs and their suffering needs to come into some shared space, some third of agreement. We need to be able to correlate, to align our stories, bearing witness to ourselves, bearing witness to our community, bearing witness to the other, whoever the other are. And you see this so much, obviously, in the discussions around, well, let's say Israel-Palestine at the moment. And those voices which are willing to listen to the other and understand the other's story about what's going on, and those who are completely unwilling and have only one story of theirs from their identity. So really, my feeling when I enter the Zendo, for good or bad, ties up with all of this. And while when I'm in the Zendo, I'm quiet, I'm cutting down, I'm limiting, I'm withdrawing from so much of the world. When I'm out in the world, it's not enough to say, well, yeah, okay, we've heard you, that's fine, now shut up. Relationship, actual relationship, demands the ability not only to hear, but to respond to this hearing, to be willing to change, to offer change, perhaps even on occasion to demand change. We can take this, obviously, to the level of actual politics. We can talk about democracy, we can talk about ethics. These are all the practice of the relational. As so often with the precepts, we're asking ourselves, is this a question of abstract rules, or is this a question of relationship? How do we relate? How do we resolve the inevitability of me not being the same as you through the mechanism of our not separateness? Whether with ourselves, whether with each other, whether with our partners, whether with our families, whether with nations. It's fundamentally the same set of questions. Our practice is the practice of relation and relationship. And the recognition that otherness is not the same, but not separate, is difference, but not separate, and that otherness begins with a recognition of that otherness, that sameness, that difference within me.